Welcome. We'll wait another minute as people still find a way into the room. All right, so I think we can start. Welcome to our guest lecture today of the History Department of the Jewish Studies program. Today we are honored to have with us Shira Klein, presenting her book, Italy's Jews from Emancipation to Fascism. Shira Klein is Associate Professor of History at Chapman University, who specializes in Italian Jewish history. Her book, Italy's Jews from Emancipation to Fascism, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2018, was selected as finalist for the 2018 National Jewish Book Award. Before we start, I want to remind you that this talk, like any other event, is recorded and will be on our YouTube channel. While we're at it, I want to invite you for our next talk on April 7th. We're going to host Joshua Cole with his presentation on his book, Lethal Provocation, The Constantine Murders and Politics of French Algeria. Shira, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Sternfeld. Thanks for that introduction. And I also wanted to thank Jewish Studies and the Department of History for hosting me here today. And it's really an honor to be here with you all. And isn't it wonderful that we have this technology to bring us together in these otherwise pretty isolating times. And I always say the one issue with Zoom is that the way we normally set up the camera, and I think this is true for most speakers, and it's certainly true for us today, is that we always capture the shoulders up. And being Israeli, I really love to use my hands. Actually, you might have heard of the joke about how Israelis love to use their hands. So I'll start with a quick joke. A man walks down a street in Tel Aviv and he's holding a watermelon in each hand, right? So he's got one in each hand. And he's stopped by a tourist and the tourist says to him, "Excuse me, do you know how to get to such and such a street?" And the watermelon man tries to use his hands to answer. And he goes, "Well," and finally he tells the tourist, "Here, take this." And he gives her one watermelon. And he says, "Take this." And he gives her the other watermelon. And then he goes, "I don't know," throwing up his hands. So that's a pre-Zoom joke. Today would probably be something like, "I don't know how to screen share this, the directions." Anyway, so today I'm going to speak about Italian Jews with a focus on the World War II period. And I'm going to do two things. First, I'll speak about what happened, and then I'll speak about how that period is remembered. And I'll show that these two things, history and memory, don't exactly align with one another. So let me share my screen, share my PowerPoint with you. Let's start with a little bit of historical background on Italian Jews. And as I tell you, let me show you a painting to help you go back in time. Up to the 19th century, Italian Jews lived in ghettos like this one pictured over here in Rome. They were segregated neighborhoods where Jews had to live. And even though they could come and go freely during the day, there was a curfew at night. And you can get a sense of the crowdedness from this painting. Because the population of the ghetto kept on growing, but the ghetto size stayed the same, the population became more and more crowded. And in fact, if anybody's been to Venice, where the ghetto neighborhood is still much as it was in the early modern period, the ghetto neighborhood is the neighborhood in Venice with the tallest buildings, precisely because the Jewish population kept growing and the space that they were in did not. So there were restrictions on what Jews could do for a living. For instance, they could work in money lending, and they could work in petty trade. And you can see them over here engaged in petty trade. There were also restrictions on who they could marry, so they could only marry Jews. Now, all of these restrictions ended in the 19th century in the wake of a movement called the Risorgimento. This was the liberal movement that swept the peninsula and created the modern Kingdom of Italy. And you can see over here, it began with the Kingdom of Piedmont, also known as the House of Savoy or the Kingdom of Sardinia. It's all the same, many different names for the same kingdom. And you can see how slowly it gobbles up more and more of the peninsula until it has taken over the entire peninsula under this one crown. And somewhere along the way in 1861, calls it Italy. So one of the side effects of this unification was more religious liberties, because the Kingdom of Piedmont and the people unifying Italy in this way relied on liberal lobbies. So they needed liberal groups to help them, and the liberals said, okay, we'll give you our help, but only if you give us these and these and these liberties. And one of them was religious liberties. So really it was a side effect of unification that Jews benefited from. And in the wake of that, so the liberties that they were given was basically freedom of religion. The ghetto walls were torn down. Jews could live anywhere they wanted to. Restrictions were lifted. And this entire process was known as emancipation. This happens in the 19th century. Jews made up a tiny percent of Italian society. You can see over here just 0.1%. That's really, really very tiny. And because of that, and also I was going to say that they lived mostly in towns and cities, and mostly in the north of Italy. So Rome and Florence and Genoa, Turin, Milan, Trieste, Venice. There were almost no Jews living in the south, because historically the kingdom of the two cities had expelled Jews in the early modern period. So most Jews lived in the center and northwards and in the cities. And because they lived in these areas, these were exactly the areas of Italy that industrialized. The center and the north, and particularly in the cities, and industrialization exploded in the late 19th century. So Jews steadily joined the ranks of the bourgeoisie, meaning the middle class, and they worked in trade, in this new industry, in the civil service, in the free professions, and they really they really saw a rise in their standard of living. Now, all was not golden, even long before Mussolini came to power, because there was anti-Semitism. And these are a couple of examples that I've given over here. I'll speak about them in a second, but I'll just say that Italy was the last country in Western Europe to give Jews equal rights. And it was the last to open its ghettos. Rome did so only in 1870, right? That's really late. That's a full century, almost a full century after the French Revolution, when France emancipated its Jews. And the ghetto period left its mark, so that still in the early 20th century, there were many stereotypes circulating about Jews. And this is one of them. Beware the dangers of international Jewish Masonic Bolshevism. So seeing Jews as international conspirators, loyal to no country, money grabbing, Bolshevist, evil. And this is an example just from a regional newspaper from Northwest Italy, a really sleepy area. But a far more widespread example was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which you may have heard of. This was supposedly a scheme by Jews to take over the world. But in fact, it was written by anti-Jewish Russians. And the Italian press translated the protocols in 1921 and published 15,000 copies, and immediately all 15,000 copies sold out. So this, again, is just an indication that anti-Semitism was very much around. Still, by World War I, Jews were extremely integrated into Italian society, and they were really patriotic. They were very happy to be Italian. And this wartime picture illustrates this kind of patriotism. You see, these are Jewish men, they're fighting for Italy. You can tell they're proud to fight because they chose to be photographed in their officer uniforms. Italy was their fatherland, and they fought and died for it. And Italian Jews fought and died for Italy in the same percentages as non-Jewish Italians. And they did so even though it meant fighting against other Jews, which it did because Italy was at war with Austria. So Italian Jews found themselves fighting against Austrian Jews. You can also see that these men look like any other Italians. There was, and even when they were out of their uniforms, there was nothing specifically Jewish about their appearance. No traditional clothing, no beards that you would see among the Orthodoxy in Eastern Europe. And not even the rise of a fascist dictatorship in 1922 interrupted the sense of belonging that Italian Jews have. And here's a picture of a family in fascist uniform with a little boy saluting, giving the fascist salute. And the fact is that Italian Jews at first did not oppose Benito Mussolini, who was the head of the fascist dictatorship. Many Italian Jews accepted fascism, some supported it. And despite those stereotypes that I showed you before, that they were Bolshevists, there were actually very few Italian Jewish Bolshevists, and most Italian Jews tended to be far more conservative, and again, did not really have an issue with Mussolini at first. So this is the background of Italian Jewish history, and overall, I would say a happy picture. And this happy story comes to a stop in 1938 when persecution began. Persecution began as a top-down process by the Italian government. In July, the government issued a manifesto of race saying, Italians are a race and Jews don't belong to that race. And this is an illustration. These two pictures are illustrations of the government stand. They are cover pages of a government-sponsored magazine called The Defense of the Race, of course, a sort of manipulative title. And it was issued right after this manifesto of the race came out. This one over here depicts the hierarchy of races as the Italian government understood it. So you have Italians at the top, they're portrayed as pure, as noble, and then you have these two inferior races, Africans who were perceived as inferior beings by Italians. And remember, this is a time of colonialism. This is a time when Italy had taken over whole swaths of Africa and set up an empire in East Africa. And then this figure over here is meant to represent Jews, stereotyped with a big nose. That was a legacy of medieval imagery. And then note also the sword over here, cutting off these two threatening inferior races from the threatened superior race of Italians. Here again, this is a little more obvious. The Star of David, represented as serpents, and the kind of the Aryan muscular arm reaching in to strangle the danger of the Jewry presented. In September 1938, Mussolini established a series of racial laws. And they were very similar to Germany's Nuremberg laws. So they said, for instance, that Jews couldn't work in most professions, they could not employ Christian housekeepers, they could not marry non-Jews, they could not publish, they couldn't advertise, they couldn't exhibit their art, they couldn't belong to sports clubs, they couldn't visit the beach. You name it, it probably existed. And Italy passed these racial laws, I should add, independently of Germany, because Italy had its own homebred racial theorists. And these racial theorists certainly drew inspiration from Germany and from the Nuremberg laws, which had happened 3 years before, but they also had an Italian model to draw on, and that is racial segregation in Italian Africa. So again, Italy had these colonies, and there was a huge amount of segregation in the empire. And so the racial laws against Jews draw on the same kind of language. And in some respects, Italian laws against the Jews were less draconian than the German laws. So for instance, Italians never ventured into the bedroom. They didn't prohibit sexual relations, which the German laws did. But in one area, the Italian laws were actually more restrictive than the German laws, because, and that was the area of education. Because in 1938, At that point in Germany, Jewish children were barred from some public schools, but not all of them. In Italy, as soon as the laws come out, they are barred. Italian Jewish children were barred from every single public school in Italy. Basically, every single school, and they had to set up their own Jewish schools. Here is another government-sponsored magazine, this time for children. This is showing a Jewish beggar. You can see him over here. And then here is an innocent little boy, clearly not Jewish, who gives him his food, he gives him his money. But then his older and wiser friend comes along, dressed in the fascist youth uniform, and he exposes the Jewish man for what he really is, which is a gold hoarder, and then kicks him out of Italy at the border. And of course, you can see the big nose, the stereotypical Jewish representations. So this was a magazine for children. The government's policies are one side of the coin, and they came through in laws, they came through in this kind of propaganda, government-sponsored propaganda. You might be wondering, what about ordinary Italians? Did they join in this persecution? Did they oppose it? Did they stand by? And the sources suggest a mix. So some Italians showed compassion. They strengthened friendships with Jews. They went the extra miles to help their Jewish neighbors or their Jewish friends. But other Italians joined in government-sponsored discrimination. And that's because, again, anti-Semitism, as I said, was nothing new in Italy. Italian society was familiar with anti-Jewish stereotypes. And that's why in 1938, when this propaganda comes out and the racial laws come out, it doesn't take a huge change of mind or a huge leap of the imagination for rank and file Italians to join in, right? Because those stereotypes have already been percolating. So here's an example of, here's one example of ordinary Italians discriminating against Jews of their own record. And this is a woman setting up a sign saying, "This shop is Aryan." So she's either announcing, look, we're not a Jewish shop, or she's announcing, we don't serve Jewish customers. And there was no law saying that against serving Jewish customers, or there was no law saying that Aryan stores had to announce themselves as such. And so here is an example of someone jumping before they were pushed, so to speak. Another source that tells us about the approach of ordinary Italians is Jewish testimonies. And I want to show you a quick clip from a testimony of a woman from Livorno. Her name is Elena Ottolenghi, and she reflects on the time of the racial laws. And her family eventually immigrated to the United States, and that's why it's in English. So I'll put this on, it's about a minute long. And while you're listening to this, see if you can notice what here is state sanctioned and what here is an expression of what ordinary Italians did. So Lior, just jump in and tell me if the volume isn't working for any reason, but we did test it, so it should be okay.
My father lost his job. He was also told that he was no longer a member of the military reserve. He had been in the Alpine Corps. We were not allowed to go to the public school, which I mentioned. We were not allowed as Jews to have anyone working for us who was not Jewish. And that meant that our babysitter, who lived with us and loved us very deeply, was allowed to stay with us a few months extra because we were special Jews, so to speak. But then she had to leave. And that was very traumatic because she was a part of the family. She felt it as a trauma, and so did we. It affected our friendships in that a few people stopped being our friends. They just didn't speak with us anymore. Although most of our friends tried to make up for the insanity of the laws by showing us special friendship and continuing to visit and to interact with us.
So as Ottolenghi shows, there was a mix. There was both anti-Semitism from above by the government through these laws, through the propaganda, And there was anti-Semitism from below, and Ottolenghi acknowledges that some friends stood by them, and then she also says that others turned away, no longer saying hello in the street. And this surfaces in most other testimonies I've looked at, and I looked at about 100 to 150 memoirs. And I would say that others describe even more isolation than Ottolenghi, because Ottolenghi left really early. She left right after the racial laws. But as time went on, Jews became ever more isolated. So what happens in the couple years after the racial laws? Italy joins the war in June 1940 on the side of Nazi Germany. And right away, as soon as it joins the war, it begins to intern Jews in concentration camps in Italy. And remember, all this time, Italy is absolutely independent. Another thing that happens at this time is denunciations. This is an example of a denunciation. Denunciations were anonymous letters from Italian neighbors or acquaintances to the police reporting that Jews were evading the racial laws. So here's an example. This is from a person, a non-Jewish person, writing, "A few days ago, I happened to go to a concert in Viareggio," and Viareggio is a beach town. And then they write, "I saw the Volterra family from Florence," and Volterra is a well-known Italian Jewish name. It would be like immediately recognizable, kind of like Cohen or Levy would be in the US. And then they write, "Isn't there a law forbidding foreigners and Jews from going to the beach?" So this is a person writing to the police saying, you know, Jews are evading the laws, please go and find them, or please go and arrest them, please go and catch them. So this was a phenomenon that abounded at this time. These years also saw a rise in violence and plunder. This included synagogue lootings, and this is an image of the ransacked synagogue of Ferrara. Rabbis were beaten up. Italian Jews faced casual violence from people they knew, whether beatings, cuffs, slaps. And this was, again, ordinary Italians at work. Sometimes it was neighbors, often it was child bullies. In 1942, the fascist government subjected some Italian Jews to forced labor, in this case, lugging lumber. But things went from bad to really, really much worse in summer of 1943. And to understand why, let's take a look at this map. In 1943, the Allies were making huge progress. They landed in North Africa, and it was evident that the tide was turning. Now, part of the fascist leadership, headquartered in Rome, decided, okay, things don't look good for the Axis powers. We need to switch sides. And so, again, this is part of the fascist leadership. And this part of the fascist leadership, what they do is they oust Mussolini, they put him in prison, and they sign an armistice with the Allies, who then enter the south of Italy and begin working their way northwards. And this area on the map represents Allied territories, and the front line inches upwards as the war wears on until eventually it reaches the very north of Italy. But in response, Germany, which was Italy's ally up until now, takes over the north, and this is the brown area on the map. And the Germans rescue Mussolini from prison and reinstate him at the head of a regime headquartered in a little town called Salò, which is at the southern tip of Lago di Garda over here. And Mussolini's regime rules from 1943 to 1945, and it's also known as the Republic of Salò. Now, in military matters, the Republic of Salò was a puppet government, right? So this area, the Italian regime in charge of this area was in military matters a puppet government, meaning that the Germans had the say and Italians were completely subordinate to them. But in internal affairs, including control over the police, the Italians had complete independence, and more on that in a moment. Okay, back to the Jews. So by 1943, the German policy towards Jews was very clear-cut. It was deportations to death camps. And Jews in the South, they were safe. They were under Allied rule. But if you remember, most Jews did not live in the South. Most Jews lived in the North. So there were 32,000 Jews living in the North on the eve of the German entry into the peninsula. So the Nazis come and they set right to work with deportations as soon as they arrived. They didn't even pass anti-Jewish laws first, which they do in most countries. They didn't have to because Italy had already passed those laws. And Nazi troops rounded up Jews from all of these places and sent them to be murdered in the East, the overwhelming majority to Auschwitz. The largest deportation was from Rome. In one night, 1,000 Jews were rounded up, and 1,000 doesn't sound a lot in the context of the Holocaust, but that was a big proportion for that. That was a big number for Italian Jews. Remember, the whole of Italian Jewry in the north is just 32,000. So 1,000 put on a train in sealed wagons, and they travel 5 days and 5 nights to Auschwitz, and 90% of them were gassed the very moment that they arrived. In this roundup of German Jews, in this roundup of Roman Jews, the Germans were acting solo, but not for long, because in November of 1943, the Italian government, remember headquartered in Selo, the government of Selo, decided it too wanted a hand in rounding up and deporting Jews. So it issued what is called Police Order Number 5. And this is a really important document. This was a fascist order, not a German order. And it said Jews were to be arrested and interned. Their property was to be seized. The captures would be carried out by the Italians. And the Italians had the census data telling them where the Jews lived. And they would turn them over to the Germans. And this is exactly what happened. Italians handed over the Jews that they arrested to the Germans loaded them on the trains went to Auschwitz. Between Italian police and German soldiers, roundups occurred in every major town in central and northern Italy, so that by the end of the war, 6,800 Jews were deported from Italy, of whom only 800 returned alive. And Police Order Number 5 involved the entire range of the Italian administration. It went from government ministries to police chiefs, and from police chiefs to police officers, and from police officers to rank and file policemen. Some Italian policemen did warn Jews to get away, but certainly not all. In fact, almost half of all deported Jews that we know of were arrested by Italian policemen working on their own or in collaboration with the Germans. So collecting Jews to be deported was by no means a German job only. Once again, we can ask, what were Italians outside of the police doing? Were they helping Jews? Were they collaborating with the Italian police? Were they standing by? And again, the answer is a mix. So on the one hand, over 20,000 Italian Jews went into hiding, and many of these owed their lives to non-Jewish Italians. And this is an example of a way in which non-Jewish Italians helped Jews. And this was by furnishing false IDs. IDs were one form of help. This is an ID of a woman called Anna Maria Falco. And Falco was, again, a recognizable Jewish name, kind of like Cohen or Levy would be today for American Jews. And you can see in her fake ID, her last name has been changed from Falco to Fabri, which is not a Jewish name. And this name would not have appeared on census records for Italian Jews. Now, somebody had to help her get that ID. And so that was one form of help. Other Italians gave Jews shelter. Others helped them cross the Alps over to neutral Switzerland. But again, there was a mix. Other Italian Jews were denounced by their neighbors and by acquaintances who turned them into the police, often in return for a reward. How frequent was this? It's difficult to know because of the sources. I looked at over 400 testimonies carried out by the USC Shoah Foundation with Italian Jewish-speaking survivors, and I found that fully a quarter of the interviewees mentioned betrayal. And consider that this proportion would have increased if those who perished in Auschwitz would have given testimony, because denounced Jews were more likely to have been deported at a greater rate. To sum up, it's useful to think of everything that I've been talking about as a timeline. 1938, Italians issue the racial laws. Between 38 and 43, there's a mix of top-down and grassroots anti-Semitism. top down, like sending Jews to forced labor, and grassroots, like denunciations, violence, and looting. 1943 to 1945, we see both the arrival of the Germans and deportation by the Germans, but also Italian Police Order Number 5, in which the Italians round up the Jews and turn them over to the Germans. And then we see a mix of grassroots approaches to Jews, some Italians helping Jews, but other Italians denouncing them. So now, in the time left to me, I'd like to speak a little bit about how the world has remembered these events. Because as I indicated at the beginning, the memory of this history doesn't quite align with the facts. Right after World War II and to this day, popular perceptions remember the persecution of Jews in Italy very differently from the way I've just described it to you. And by popular perceptions, I mean films, I mean novels, many museum exhibits, Wikipedia articles, really any type of non-scholarly account of this time period. And the popular perception of persecution is so different from reality that historians have called it a myth or a selective memory. And it has a few components. So first of all, the popular memory, or this kind of mythical selective memory, dates the persecution differently. And in most stories and most popular representations, the story begins in 1943, right? So the story is that the first trace of persecution begins in Italy in 1943. And who is the main perpetrator in this chronology? If we were not on Zoom, I would ask you to kind of chime in, but the main perpetrator is Germany, right? And what is missing in this kind of chronology that dates the story beginning in 43, what is missing is the racial laws, which were an Italian initiative. Second, Italian anti-Semitism is seen in the popular perception as having been not really serious, sort of half-hearted, definitely not like the serious German Nuremberg laws. But in reality, the 1938 laws were severe. And I would argue that they were as severe as the Nuremberg laws. They destroyed people's livelihood. They traumatized them emotionally. Then the other thing that the popular narrative says is that persecution was something that only Mussolini wanted, but it was totally shunned by ordinary Italians. Again, this is inaccurate because we saw the grassroots component of this persecution. Ordinary Italians had a hand in the persecution both before and after the Germans arrived. And finally, this narrative says, this popular conception says that it was primarily the Germans who hold responsibility for the deportations. And the story generally goes that Germany led Italy kicking and screaming into this horrible act, and Italy wanted nothing to do with the deportation. Again, this is a myth because in reality, through Police Order Number 5, Italians were active participants in the deportation of Jews. So now I'd like to show you an example of this myth, this mythical representation. And I'm going to show you a 1-minute excerpt from a film that encapsulates this myth or this selective memory. And this film is Life is Beautiful. It was a 1998 Oscar-winning film. I'm sure many of you have seen it. The hero is Guido. He's an Italian Jewish man with a sense of humor. He works as a waiter. He meets a young non-Jewish woman from a noble family who works as a school teacher. And in the following scene that I'm about to show you, Guido is working as a waiter at a party. And in the middle of the party, he gets called out to deal with his uncle, who's also Jewish, and his uncle is very upset because his horse has fallen victim to anti-Jewish vandalism. So let me show you this. Lior, is this visible? Can you just unmute for a second and let me know that it's visible?
It's visible.
Okay, perfect. All right. Second. Yeah, so this scene is set in 1939, right? And so it is after the racial laws have come out. And it certainly acknowledges discrimination against Jews in this period, right? That's kind of what it shows. But it still advances this very selective memory of the events. How so? Well, for one, the scene just before, and I know the subtitles came in right after, but you could just tell, right, from the way these men were joking, they're really jovial, they're really happy. Remember, this is set after the racial laws, right? So overall, this is a jovial scene. Uncle Eliseo certainly takes the vandalism seriously, but it's hard for the viewer to take it seriously. It's a horse, after all, right? It's not someone losing their job. It's not a child being kicked out of school. So the viewer gets a sense that, you know, the worst thing that happened was that a horse was sprayed on. In fact, far worse things had happened, right? This is 1939, and Italian Jews had been suffering from the racial laws for months by this point. There was nothing very jovial for any Jew in Italy at this time. The other thing is that the viewer gets the sense that persecution is a foreign import from Germany, because I don't know if anybody noticed the first word on the horse, but it was Achtung, right? So the language is German. Achtung means attention or danger. And even though it's unlikely that anything would have been written in German in pre-1943 Italy, right? There were no Germans then. The director has chosen German. And so we viewers get the message that it's not in the Italian vocabulary, literally or metaphorically, to be anti-Jewish, right? Because there was anti-Semitism at the time, but it was all in Italian. And yet here the word that was chosen was German. Another example from the film that is completely unrealistic and very sort of misleading. This is outside of the scene, but Guido and Dora, the two lovers, they get married. Of course, this was impossible in real history because the 1938 laws forbade that. So again, viewers come out sensing that there was nothing really truly terrible happening in Italy before the Germans' arrival. Surprisingly, we see that Italian Jews themselves had a similar sort of selective memory. So this film, of course, is made by Italians, Italian non-Jews, and you might say, well, it's kind of understandable that they painted themselves in flattering colors, that they showed Italian anti-Semitism as a pale imitation of German policy. But the fact is that Italian Jews too engaged in this kind of selective memory. And not in the funny way of an Oscar-winning movie, but Italian Jews have perpetuated this myth that Italians had far less of a role in the Holocaust than they actually did have. And Italian Jews began their narrative pretty early, before the war was even over. And let me show you some examples. So now these are some examples of how Italian Jews presented a really gilded version of Italy's role in the war. Here's a cartoon from an Italian Jewish newspaper towards the end of World War II. It was issued in Florence. Florence by then had been liberated, and the Jewish press sort of started anew. This is an anti-Hitler cartoon. It shows Hitler attempting to annihilate the Jews through this sort of a symbolic gesture of covering them with a swastika, and then failing miserably thanks to Jewish armed revolt. And the title is "The Game Isn't Working." Hitler is the villain over here, right? And who is absent? Mussolini. And I found not one anti-Mussolini cartoon in the Italian Jewish press in the immediate post-war period. Italians were just not talked about. And by default, they were absolved. And this is what historians sometimes call the sounds of silence, right? What you don't say is just as important as what you do say. Here's another example of this sort of commemorative trend. This is a medal, a commemorative medal issued by Italian Jews in late 1945. And I've shown it twice here. This is the way it really looks. And this, I've just added in different colors what is shown because it's a little difficult to see it in black and white relief. So this medal commemorates the Holocaust, or depicts the Holocaust in symbols. Jews are a tree, right? Here's the tree in brown. And then there's a Nazi axe trying to cut it down. But Jews persevere, and a new bud now blossoms. That was a tongue twister. Again, the culprit here is German, right? The swastika. That is the symbol that we see. There was no fascio. Fascio was the fascist symbol. We don't see that anywhere. So again, the sounds of silence. Another example is Holocaust memorials built in the late 1940s and early 1950s. These are a couple of examples from Padua and Saluzzo. And what you see over here are lists of deported Jews, and that's sort of expected enough. But note the chronology. This chronology is 1939 to 1945. 1939 emphasizes the World War, right? Nothing special was happening in Italy in 1939. The really big date for Jews in Italy was 1938, but that's not here. And then 1943 to 1945 emphasizes the German arrival and the start of the deportation. So again, nowhere over here does 1938 appear, though that was the start of the persecutions in Italy by Italians. When Jews in the post-war did depict Italians, it was often to show them as kind, as naturally good, as innately civil folk. And I'd like to show you an example of such a depiction. This is another movie from 1948 this time, and it was created by Italian Jews, by foreign Jews, and by non-Jews. And it was called The Earth Cries Out, Il Grida della Terra. And it has nothing to do with the war in Italy, which is in itself telling, right? Italian Jews did not create a film about themselves. Instead, it's about the post-war journey of Holocaust survivors to British-controlled Palestine. And in the scene that I'm going to show you, we see this one character. He's the only character in the film who's meant to actually be Italian. Everybody speaks Italian because the film is an Italian production, but there's only one character who is supposed to be Italian, and that is the captain of the ship who's in charge of taking these poor survivors to Palestine. So let me just unshare and reshare as I pull this up. All right, here we go. So in the scene that you're about to see, these two Haganah members, and there are these two over here, come to the captain and this Italian captain and ask him to save the passengers by bringing the ship closer to the shore. And he agrees to do that, even though it means that he's going to sacrifice his ship. And towards the end of the scene, you'll see this tremendous crash, meaning that the ship has indeed crashed on the rocks. So he is nobly sacrificing his ship to help these Jews.
Capitano, permettete, Joseph, mio vecchio compagno di scuola, è qui per organizzare lo sbarco.
Piacere, però sbrighiamoci perché ci sono delle novità poco piacevoli. Gli inglesi devono avere ricevuto segnalazioni. Stanno perlustrando tutta la zona.
Ma voi siete pronti?
Il mare è calmo, faremo presto. Sì, ma non abbiamo potuto spostare le nostre imbarcazioni.
Accidenti, non abbiamo che 2 scialuppe a bordo.
E la costa è sorvegliata. Vi conviene riprendere il largo.
È impossibile, abbiamo gli inglesi alle spalle. Non riusciremo a portarci fuori dalle acque territoriali.
E allora?
Questa gente io devo sbarcarla ad ogni costo. Avanti macchina, tutta!
Capitano, che cosa vuol dire? Tra 100 metri andremo in secca.
Ho detto macchina avanti, spicciamoci.
Capitano, so quel che vuol dire per voi questo.
E io so cosa significa per voi. Coraggio.
Right. So in that scene, the captain of the ship, right, he agrees to basically sacrifice his ship to help the survivors. And he's really a minor character in the film, but he's the only truly good, indisputably good character in this film. Again, this film doesn't make any direct claims about Italians' goodness during the war, but it leaves the impression that Italians had this natural inclination to help Jews. So I'm nearing the end of the presentation. I'll just give you one more example of how Italian Jews outside of Italy had the same narrative, This is a speech by an Italian Jewish emigre, Laura Fermi. She was the wife of Nobel Prize winner Enrico Fermi, a physicist. She left for the US in 1939, and in 1955, she gives a speech to the American Jewish Committee, and she calls anti-Semitism in Italy a freak accident. She describes Italians, non-Jewish Italians, as these poor puppets whose strings were held by only one person, that meaning Mussolini. And this one person, Mussolini, fell under the most evil man of all, and that is Hitler. And then all these poor puppets were dragged along and suffered. So this shows Italians, right, non-Jewish Italians, as these victims, as sort of having had nothing to do whatsoever with inflicting suffering on Jews. To summarize, the Holocaust in Italy unfolded in one way, and the world, including Jews themselves, tended to remember it in another way. Why did Italian Jews adopt this selective narrative? Why did they downplay Italian culpability? This is a topic for probably for another lecture, but I'll just give a couple of reasons sort of to whet our appetite. One is some Italian Jews did save Jews while others denounced them. So there was a full half of the glass and an empty half. And I would argue that Italian Jews who stayed in post-war Italy chose to look at the full half because that enabled them to get on with their lives, to regain a sense of normalcy. And the other reason was that Italian Jews came to think of their trauma as a mere episode in a much, much larger European tragedy, right? The Holocaust with a capital H. So for them, the tragedy of European Jews overwhelmed the pain of Italian Jews, and accordingly, the responsibility of the Germans far dwarfed Italian responsibility. And there are many more other reasons that I speak about in the book, reasons ranging from post-war peace treaties to the Cold War. But again, that would be a topic for a whole other lecture. So thank you for listening. And now we can turn to discussions and questions, and I'll unshare.
Thank you very much, Shira, for this wonderful presentation. Before we turn to questions from the attendees, I have a few questions, for to create some kind of basis for conversation. So one of it is mere numbers. How many Jews lived in Italy in 1938, and how many lived there in 1945 after the war? And then I have a question that is, it is based on the anecdotal storytelling of Italian Jews and sensational stories that find their ways to popular press and stuff. But why was there such a buy-in of Italian Jews? And maybe it's completely off. So so you can just tell me that I'm. Why was there such a buy-in of Italian Jews into fascism? And I'm saying it not just because of what you mentioned in the beginning of the talk, that but also there's always this sense of, well, you presented the mythical narrative, right, that Italian Jews created after the war, but we see that from time to time we get stories about the Jewish mistress of Mussolini, and that everything that was done was not really anti-Semitism; it was just lip service to race theories and stuff. But also a few weeks ago, I don't know if you follow the skit show in Israel, "The Jews Are Coming," and they had this one skit on the Jewish fascist soldier that decided to come to the weekend executions and found out that he's on the list. So I just, was there really a buying of Italian Jews into fascism, like in mentionable ratio? And yeah, take it.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I see another question in the chat, also a really good question. Thanks for that. So I'll try to answer, and then if anybody else has any other questions, I guess they can put it in the chat. So the number of Jews in Italy in 1938, there were 45,000 Jews. That was kind of the apex of the Jewish community. And then a number of these emigrated, a number of them converted. Some of those who emigrated then returned, some of those who converted then reconverted back to Judaism. And in 1945, the numbers are really unclear because they're in flux. And that is because Italy has a fairly sizable Jewish GP population, just like Germany and Austria. So the numbers for 1945 are really, really difficult to tell. But yeah, Italian Jewry never really returned to that, the height of those, when it was 45,000. There was buy-in into fascism, and I think that's a really astute comment. The reason that Italian Jews either supported fascism or at the very least didn't mind it or were indifferent to it, I would say. And I would say that small minorities were fervently fascist and even smaller minorities were fervently anti-fascist. But I would say the overwhelming majority were sort of either, again, indifferent or moderately in favor of fascism. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but the biggest one was class. Italian Jews were firmly middle class, and after World War I, Italy became polarized between the right, which was backed by the middle class, and the left, which was backed by the working class. And the left grew more and more militant. The leftist socialists or Bolshevists aimed for a revolution that would overturn society, and the middle class grew more and more angry and more anxious with the left and demanded a sort of authoritarian response. They grew disillusioned with the centrist government and said, you know, you're not doing enough to quash the revolts staged by the working class. And that is really why when Mussolini comes to power, they sort of breathe this audible sigh of relief. Finally, someone is going to come and save us from these militants. So I would say that that's sort of a big reason. And then, of course, there are some more in the book. I haven't seen that skit, but I definitely want to. So thanks for that. It sounds, yeah, I like the rest of their work. And then this question, what has happened more recently regarding Holocaust commemoration? That's a really good question. So
maybe read out the entire question. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
What has happened more recently regarding Holocaust commemoration? I'm thinking, for example, of the rebuilt concentration camp in Calabria that appears in the writing of the Guatemalan author Eduardo Halfon.
Yeah, so I actually have yet to read Halfon, so thanks for that reference. I will say that when I went to Italy recently for my research, I try and go to, every time I go to Italy, I try and go to sort of the latest exhibits and I try to watch the latest sort of documentaries. And I would say that I don't see a huge change taking place. I think that 1938 is still very much sort of swept under the rug. I don't think necessarily consciously. I don't think that people try to sort of what's the word I'm looking for, to warp the narrative in any way. I think that it's just a matter of really 1943 being such a dramatic moment. And I think there's probably also some sort of innate discomfort with this history of fascism, which Italian Jews were in the end a part of. Yes, it's a good question.
Thank you. Do we have more questions coming? Well, it looks like we don't have questions, and we're actually almost right on time to wrap up the conversation. Thank you so much for this talk and for enlightening us with the little-known history of Italian Jews. To our attendees, I remind you that we have another event on April 7th, and please join us. Thank you so much, Dr. Klein.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.